Thanks for joining us, everybody, for our first ADG podcast, Keepin at 800. My name is Andrew Stumme. I'm the Director of Field and Organizing, Political Coordinator, Contract Action Team Coordinator, Local 800 member. I think I need a few more titles to add to this. And I'm joined here today by Professor Gus Wood, who is a labor scholar, activist, and union deal negotiator, and has been organizing labor for about over 20 years.
Yeah.
Beginning with low-wage workers in the restaurant industry and sanitation public workers. So I'm going to give you an opportunity real quick. Just tell us more about your work and your success in helping unions like ours. Go.
Well, sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. Just the first time I was able to work with ADG, it was a real pleasure and one of the highlights of everything I've ever done, because I've seen the fire, I've seen the strategy and the kinds of steps you're taking to make sure your membership is holding itself accountable to winning better conditions. And so I'm just so honored to be back. But in terms of just what I've done over the 2 decades that I've been organizing, as well as helping negotiate and researching the labor struggles that are in this country, I mean, it really goes back to just coming from a family in Atlanta where unions were busted in the 1970s, the public sector, and growing up in a household and neighborhood where there was a lot of animosity towards business owners and the local government for the joint effort in destroying unions. So I was raised with this very pro-worker, pro-union family, especially in the Deep South in Atlanta, and I took a lot of that energy and animosity and went on to become the president of my local 6300, a graduate employees organization, at the University of Illinois when I was getting my PhD in African American labor history. And long story short, we did a bunch of really great things because our membership base was amazing, and we were all able to win a strike of 14 days, which at the time was the longest university strike, until University of California broke that.
You're welcome.
A few years later, exactly right. But since then, I typically like the A-Team. If you remember that great show, the A-Team, where they would just drive around and they would go and there would be an issue in the town they stopped in, and they would help be a resource to resolve the issue. It was typically a rich person or somebody doing something bad to the neighborhood, and of course they would have shootouts and nobody would get shot. It would just be a lot of bullets, a lot of explosions, but everybody lived though.
Yeah.
And then they would leave the area. So that's kind of what I do, is like unions or other organizations will call me up and they'll say, hey, we have an issue related to what we're doing in the bargaining room, or we're trying to plan a strike, or we're just trying to assess our membership to see where they're currently at. And so I would go out and I would help, because I'm getting a PhD and doing all this experience means absolutely nothing if I'm just sitting in a library or if I'm just reading and writing things. I need to be able to transfer my work and my strategy to the groups in struggle, which are the working people. And so that's why I continue to do that and use my access to resources to build power for workers. And so that's a very short summation of why I do this work.
Well, that's great. I mean, I think, and we appreciate, you coming out here and lending that guidance and expertise to our own, contract fights and our own membership. I think it's very telling how you've remained, like, you took action, right? You could have easily, like you said, I could just be buried in my books studying, but I want to take what I'm learning and be active. Exactly. And I think that's sort of what probably part of the topic of the day is, right, where it's like, how do we activate our members? How do we sort of make sure that our members are participatory in this process that we currently find ourselves in? We're currently in our negotiation process. It's important. It's the one thing that really touches your life, that contract that you are working under. And so, I think that's where we can sort of discuss today,
Sure.
What some, how we, you and I know,
Sure.
right? But how we can talk to our members about, what that means,
Yes.
what that means to be active, what that means to really, help your bargaining team
Exactly.
at this level. I think one great tool that we've implemented here at Local 800 is a CAT program, or Contract Action Team. And maybe you talk, if you have experience with cats, and talk a little bit about that.
Very much so. Yeah, that's one of my biggest proposals in the work I do with unions has always been that you cannot have a bargaining team that is in charge of doing everything inside and outside the room. That there has to be an organized, and let me be clear, it has to be an organized, formalized team of membership whose job it is to coordinate the actions outside the room. Because if you ask the bargaining team to do those things as well, you're going to burn out your bargaining team. And again, when you're talking about these large negotiations where you have master contracts, local contracts, etc., that your bargaining team doesn't have the capacity to coordinate the on the ground movement. And just to kind of go back a bit, this is what we saw happen historically in the 1960s and 1970s, where you had this kind of pull back after everything goes on, the 50s, the civil rights movement, labor movement stuff. You had a lot of bargaining teams that were not as attached to the ground anymore as they had been in the pre-World War II, and also right after World War II, you have the big general strike movement. So you end up losing that kind of connection to the ground because there is no organized, formalized action team on the ground. But what you see for the unions that have in the 1990s and to the present day, especially now that's making the resurgence, that you have rank and file members and leadership that come together to form these action teams. You can call them action teams, you call them strike teams, you call whatever you want, but their main purpose is to make sure that communication and as well as the escalating of actions is coordinated strategically with the bargaining team, that there is this relationship that I can't move at the table unless I know what's happening on the ground, and vice versa. I can't move on the ground unless I know what's going on at the table. And so it creates a deep relationship that alleviates a lot of the issues that members see when they say, I don't know what's happening at the table, or I don't know what's happening with my membership. This cancels that out because there has to be an accountability to communication structures and to what's happening on both sides. And so again, when I've done this with other unions, in my experience, in the history I've read about this, the membership has always just escalated in terms of activation, particularly for disillusioned or jaded members who didn't really have a lot of support for bargaining at the time because they had to hold themselves accountable. This is what we call the organizing model of unionism, to where the bargaining team is not given sole responsibility for just delivering a service to the membership because they pay dues. No. If I'm the membership, it is my job to be accountable to what the bargaining team is doing by helping in every way deliver the win. So everybody becomes a participant, and it doesn't make it to where you're putting all the stress on the bargaining team. It's about all the membership. And again, the reason we're here is because of the historical backlash to the organizing efforts in previous eras.
Yeah, that's great, because I think the last thing, we want to give ourselves the best chance of success and getting that win. And so the last thing you want on both sides of that coin, of the bargaining team and the membership, is the ground to shift from under you, right?
Exactly.
You want to know where your membership's at, and as a bargaining team, and the membership wants to know where the bargaining team's at. And so, these CAT teams create that really effective two-way communication structure to, in real time, know where those points of pressure are, know what those strategies are, and they are an extremely effective tool. I mean, we've just launched ours, but we are already reaping, I think, the benefits of it, and in terms of setting a tone, in terms of getting information from members, and figuring out, even though we're very early in our negotiation process, but sort of making sure that members are informed and that we're receiving that as well. I think talking about, I think strategy a little bit. I mean, we can't really go into our strategy, obviously, because we're at a point where we don't even know what our strategy is.
Sure.
It to be blunt, I mean,
Yep.
we've just started the process, but I think maybe talking a little bit about how you activate those cat teams in certain ways, or membership in certain ways to achieve those wins, right?
Yeah, some of my favorite stuff, really. I mean, it's my specialty is strategy. How do you leverage heat on the opposition, the employer? The first thing is that members have to first understand what heat is that there has to be some raising of an issue to the point to where members feel uncomfortable knowing they exist with this issue occurring. It can't just be, oh, this issue occurs, I can still live with it, I can deal with it, I'm okay with neglecting it. We have to find a way to leverage that heat. And my idea is that, and I know some people are very supportive of employers and bosses, whatever, but here's the thing, is that the employer's purpose is to generate heat just from their very position, because in this country, in this world, you have to maximize profits by cutting labor costs. The most expensive part of a business is labor costs, right? And so just from their very position as being the owner of a business or the decision-making body, whether it be management under the owner, they have to cut labor costs. So in their very position, not just what they do or say at the table, but just them being there, they're generating heat because they're spending day by day finding ways to cut labor costs or cut your conditions down to the bone. And so how do you get your members to understand and see that to the point to where they're willing to take a risk? They're willing to come to a meeting. They're willing to design a flyer. They're willing to go to a protest. And then each thing is getting bigger until you get to the point where you say, you know what? I've made these risks and I've tried to work with the employer at the bargaining table and it hasn't worked. So now I'm willing to take the last risk I have to, if necessary, which is to go on strike. The last thing you ever want to do, but is the last option if you get to it. And so again, strategically, there are so many ways for both the leadership and the members to hold each other accountable to that escalation. You can have surveys, you can have town hall meetings, which I found have been one of my favorite things to always do. You can have social events if it's a really kind of cool action, especially if you have let's say you have a new issue that becomes a campaign at the table. A lot of members may not understand how artificial intelligence or how healthcare or how whatever issue that comes up at the table operates at that current moment. And so having a cold or cool social event at first to educate, like a teach-in or some type of thing like that, and then of course afterwards, then you can have more access and more understanding because members are saying, okay, we're part of the process now. So now you can think of more heated ways to protest. You can now start talking about having rallies. You can start doing social media blasts. You can start doing all these other things that are related to the experiences of the workers. And that really is kind of the foundation for how do you get CAT teams to really activate membership, is that you're putting the members' experiences, their issues at the heart of the organizing at the table. So again, they'll always know that what's happening at the table is from my issues, my experiences. And so that's the cornerstone of it. And that's why the CAT teams are so important, because they're talking to the members on the ground and they're using that to develop their escalation tactics in line with the bargaining team who are using those experiences at the table. See, that's that relationship that builds. And that's what gets members to say, you know what? The leadership does care about what we're doing. This is our contract. This is not the bargaining teams. It's our contract, and we have to be held accountable. And if we don't participate and we don't put forth the risk, we're not going to get what we want. And so really, there's so many different ways to leverage that heat against the opposition, but it has to come from the fact that our experiences are driving what happens at the table.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think another perspective on that is also building the trust between, the membership and the leadership and the bargaining team.
Exactly.
Because, that if you don't have that trust, it's not you're giving those teams from the bargaining side those instructions, but they're not fully invested. They're not ready to, they're not going to take that risk.
Exactly.
And I think part of that building of that trust is to, it inherently in our structures. Sometimes there's a mistrust of institutions, right? Even members to unions.
Yes,
and
definitely.
I think sometimes if me with all those long titles I said at the top of this go talk to members like, oh, there's Stumme again, just telling me more stuff. But when it's coming from somebody who's sitting across from you in the art department or across from you on the work site, it's far more effective, and it builds that trust because that's somebody they're working with, they're shoulder to shoulder with, and they're saying, yeah, I know I have this information, I could share it with you, and really get members who may not be paying as much attention activated.
And let me chime in there because now we have to talk about the flip side of that. If the strategy is not actually taken advantage of, because what typically happens is that you'll have management side who wants to control the narrative. And what happens is if members aren't having that deep connection and relationship to what's occurring at the table from the union, then what they'll get is the management's narrative. And the management narrative is always that the union is dragging its feet, the union is greedy, the union's doing this or that. So when something happens in bargaining, and those members, when they're getting all this management stuff, guess what happens? When something happens, they start to blame the union, and they turn the union into heels or villains of their own membership. And that's when you burn turf. And so, again, this is why I emphasize so much the engagement of the membership and the creation and controlling of the narrative, is because if you're dominating the narrative that everybody hears about the issues of security, the issues of our conditions, etc., if that's what everybody's hearing, management's reacting to it, you're telling the truth, you have all this information out there, then what happens is that management's always playing defense at the table as well as in the media. And so again, this is why if you don't get the narrative early on in negotiations, it's very difficult to recapture it down the road, especially when you have to start asking members to do things like take votes on strikes or to take votes on other actions you may want to do. Dealing with other unions, they do civil disobediences and things where you have to have civil disobedience training. You're asking people to risk going to jail. It's harder for people to take bigger risk if they spent that time during escalation always hearing the management's narrative. So why would I risk somebody I don't trust? Going back to your point, is that we have to establish trust so that the building of escalations to get the wins at the table matters. Because again, when you do TA something and you get a win and you get another one, what it does to the membership, because they knew they were part of getting that TA because they committed, they were accountable, they took risks, it's going to build you up for your big stuff that you really want to get later on the contract. So that's why all these things really matter at the end of the day, controlling the narrative and keeping the membership apart.
Absolutely. There's already, I'm already anecdotally, in this process, hearing a very good example of what you're saying, where somebody on, the work site was like, talking to another local member, and it was one of our CAT members, and telling me, and they said, look, they came at me and they said, the union's already agreed to something, and it's lower than what we expected. How am I going to trust? And that was like, came to me and said, is that true? I said, we haven't even started. Like, how would we agree to anything if we haven't even started, right? And so I think, but I talked to this CAT member, and I said, look, go back and discuss with them and say, hey, I checked with, people who were in the room, and they said, and have that discussion, build even across local, build that trust, build that narrative.
Exactly.
Starting now, because you're absolutely right. Where did they, and we said, and even ask them, where'd you get that information?
Exactly.
Where did that come from? Who are you talking to? Because it very well could be the producer came by and said, hey, did you know, this has already been agreed to, and why did they're not in the room? They don't know.
Of course not.
And so it is. I think we're already seeing some of that, but I think right now, the where we're at is we want a deal, right? That's what we want.
Exactly.
And that's that's actually up to the employer at this point. We know what we want, and so I think grabbing that narrative is super important.
Let's talk about that, because I think you bring up a very important point, because you just said, what does the employer want? There are typically two things that employers go to the bargaining table for. The first one is to TA a regressive contract, because what a regressive contract does is, whether it be in a mandatory subject of bargaining, which are the conditions of employment, wages, healthcare, etc., versus the permissive subjects, which are the conditions of work, right? So you have two different sets. They want to TA a regressive article or something that reduces the power of bargaining in the language of the contract, whether it be in one article or multiple. They just need it there, because what their plan is over time, and you can read about this, a lot of billionaires and millionaires write about how they tried to bust unions, and they'll tell you that if the membership has to ratify regressive contracts consistently over time, then they start to become disillusioned and they stop participating, and the bargaining unit erodes over time. That is the main strategy of the employer when they go to the bargaining table. I'm not saying that individually they're all these evil Disney villains and they want to just destroy unions. No, but when they go to trainings on how to do management bargaining, they tell them in those trainings, you need to regress the contract in some way, because if you don't, their membership is going to remain vibrant. They're going to be able to get newer members into the union, and you're going to see a losing of power. So they say you have to reduce their bargaining power some way. And so again, let's just be honest. On the flip side of it, as you just mentioned, Andy, what the union's main purpose is to do is to win a progressive contract, so that when you take it to ratification and then you take the next one to ratification, members see that you're winning consistently, something that's elevating the working and living conditions of people. Then they are going to understand, and this is the key thing that we have to do across the United States right now, is that the union has to be the primary space where working people can see, if I have a problem, the union is the space I go to. It's the primary space to go to deal with a major problem around my working and living conditions. And then at that change, after a decade or so of that, then you have the union culture returning to what it used to be, to where, you moved into a neighborhood, the first thing you did was you went and got a union card. Well, you got a cake or some muffins or something from your neighbor, because back then you just walked in people's houses. If you lived in the neighborhood, everybody was cool with each other, but you went to get your union card. And so again, people now look to, and I'm not saying these spaces aren't good spaces to fight in, but people mainly look to voting now, or they mainly look to probably nonprofits or some other organization. Those are fine, but in the pushing of those institutions, you've seen over the past 40 years the devaluation of the union as a space where people can go to rectify legitimate problems in their workspace or their living conditions. We have to get back to the union being up there with the rest of those, and saying like, no, wait a minute now. If I get a job anywhere in this country, I want to make sure that I can join a union, because I know a union will fight for all the things that I know will come about me being an employee. So that's the reason why it's so important to understand why you're doing this work with your CAT teams, creating this communication structure, the strategy of the members' issues driving the table, because again, you're going to change the culture of the union, and then the United States overall, around working people wanting unions to be progressive, powerful spaces.
I think unions are a great tool to fight cynicism in our culture. And what I mean by that is saying, like, just what you're saying is there's over the course of the last few years, and probably heightened by the pandemic and everything we've gone through, there's a deep mistrust of organizations. And I mentioned that earlier, right? There's just this sort of built-in mistrust. But when I go and talk to members, or I talk to folks, and potential members, and people, even family, I'm like, but unions are the one organization that has such a direct impact on somebody's life immediately.
Exactly.
It's an immediate impact. You see, when you join a union, if on an economic level, you see an increase in your wages. You see
across the board.
You see you have access to health care. You have access to retirement. And it's an organization that has your best interests in mind. And we value work so much in this country as a culture that it's a little paradoxical to me that we value this. We have this work ethic, so to speak.
Well, yeah, they tell us.
Yeah, and yet union. It's shifting.
You're right. You're exactly right.
But union sort of that there's that disconnect, right?
You're exactly right.
Yeah. Of wait, but I definitely want to work hard, but I want to make sure I'm getting paid. I want to make sure I can retire with dignity. I want to make sure I can get my health care.
No. They say, no, wait a minute now. We want you to have a work ethic, and we want you to contribute to society as a U.S. citizen. We want you to do all this other stuff, but you just can't decide how you contribute. That's our job.
Yeah.
We create the means of production. We determine how you can contribute, and then when we want to reshift it, then that's what we'll do. See, that's why I'm glad you brought this up, because again, that's what we're seeing happening right now as the union movement and the wildcat striking over the past 3 to 4 years has skyrocketed. And we're talking about over 200% of the strikes have gone up 200% over the past 3 years, many of them being wildcat strikes, but you had a bunch of organized union strikes as well. We're witnessing the backlash today. I don't know if you saw the news, but now Lyft and Uber are leaving Minneapolis because the protests in Minneapolis for a minimum wage law worked, and the local government instituted one. And so Lyft and Uber now are basically unemployed. Thousands of people that work there, most of them being working class, poor, black and brown folks. And now they don't have a job anymore because Uber and Lyft are leaving Minneapolis. You cannot drive Uber and Lyft anymore based on today's announcement. And so again, what you're having is people are falling out of the class structure, and they're having to go and do what I call sub-proletarian or sub-working class labor that's non-union, unstable, and no benefits, low wage, and what people call dirty work. It's low quality work, and that's what they're pushing people towards. These warehouses they're building all over the South for people to do after they graduate high school. The building trades now are still closed off, so you can't get in and become an apprentice to do that work. Construction is become a joke to where they're locking out a lot of young people who want to get into the construction trades. So again, this is a backlash to all the work that happened with the Hollywood strikes last year, to the general mass strikes of 2021, 2022, and going back to the teacher strikes that began in 2018. I mean, there's just been this resurgence of labor power that people feel like exactly what you said, that there is this idea that the union is becoming, again, the cusp of a space where problems can be solved. And the opposition has recognized that people are turning more towards the possibility of unionizing. And so you're having this push away from living wage, well-paid jobs into these spaces where they cannot or have more difficulty being unionized. Deep South fast food labor, hospitality work, spaces like that, warehouse labor. So yeah, that's why the fight that you all are having right now is so crucial. The stakes are high for this fight.
Yeah, and I think, we throw in another ingredient that we're now facing in our industry, which is, and you and I talked about this, which is, globalization, right? I think there was for a very long time, it's sort of maybe a misunderstanding in our industry, in the entertainment industry. Oh, this is American work, right? Nobody else does this. But when you look at from the perspective of, that pot of money. And that's where the employer's looking at, right? They're looking at that pot of money. Yep. And when entertainment work across the board is, and I'm talking video games, sports, I'm encompassing all entertainment work, is second in GDP behind military spending for this country. Right. And you know how we love to spend in our military. They see that pot of money and they see that that's ripe for the picking.
Exactly. And
just like any other industry in this country, whether automobile, steel workers, anything that we are manufacturing, we have seen the effects of globalization and going, we're on the cusp of that.
Exactly.
I think. And so, that's where I think we're seeing a bit of reaction on the union level of saying, hey, wait a minute, right? We need to protect the work. And so, maybe if they
or protect the profits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so, again, this is one of the scariest things about the possibilities of globalization. I guess we can go ahead and, we can dump in artificial intelligence now, is that there is a means right now to devalue the labor. So again, I know a lot of people like to talk about the Terminator 2 scenario of artificial intelligence and all that. While that's not off the table, this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about, and this goes back to the 1950s when they automated the auto industry, which led to all these wildcat strikes and other organizing in the auto workers, is that when you introduce new technology, and particularly a globalized technology that's not regulated by the federal government, then you have business owners trying to reap as much profit as possible off the use of said technology before the regulators come in. That's why there's this mad dash to both regulate and also to ship work in production overseas. Like there's this mad dash to do it very quickly if people have been reading a lot of the stories that have been going out there, because they know that within the next 4 to 5 years, which is way too long a time, you're going to see regulation of these kinds of technologies. But just like in the 1950s and the 1980s, when they started bringing in data processing units that will become computers, that completely wiped out a lot of the labor sources for women in the 1980s, to the point to where women were forced to either have to go back to working class labor because of sexism, etc., or the ones who were part of the middle and upper class and could afford to go to college, they went to college. But there was a stable base of labor for women workers that was wiped out because of technology. And so again, what we're having, that's going to happen again today because of the lack of federal regulation that goes back decades, is this issue that not only can you allow the labor that you work so hard to do here, to be globalized and taken to Australia or taken to these other parts of the world out of the reaches of your union, but you also have the capacity for them to devalue said labor in terms of bringing in outside technology that can be used at the behest of the employer. So again, this is a dual strategy that you're currently having to face right now. And we as workers, that not just in your industry, but across the world, we need to be screaming about this and pushing for unions to have decision-making power over the offsetting of labor, but also the use of new technologies. Because if you allow management to do it by themselves, or you let the federal government deregulate it, then you're going to erode your bargaining unit over time.
And as you pointed out, that's the strategy.
Exactly.
Right? And so, I think one bright spot that recently, we got the support of the global entertainment community. They vocalized very strong support for our bargaining right now, and I think that it why I say it's a bright spot is that while we're talking about production going to other places, those communities that have unions in other countries are looking at it and saying, what happens in the U.S. is going to happen here too. So you don't really have anywhere to run.
Exactly.
And so you better get a good deal, because it's not going to be the cost savings you think it is coming over here.
But again though, again, though, this is the thing about capital in general and businesses is that, yes, it's about money, but it's more so about power and control. Here's the example I always use. The rail workers near strike 2 years ago, Christmas, December. All they wanted was a day off for medical leave. That was the bone for the strike. They didn't care about the money, but yet they were willing to invoke a congressional act to break that strike if they struck over getting a day for medical leave. That's why at the end of the day, yeah, the bosses are willing to pay extra money. They're now paying millions of dollars in strike busting lawyers and other agencies that they wouldn't have to pay if they just allowed the union into their employee base. I'm talking about multiple industries here. So again, yes, the money matters. They want to make the profits and make the money that, but at the end of the day, what's happening in the U.S. with everybody rising to the idea that labor unions and militancy, with the Wildcats too, is a means to improving your conditions, they have to fight back against that. And going overseas where it's not as volatile as it is right now in the U.S. saves them some face. So that's why they're willing to spend a little money and go overseas while the labor stuff could cool off a bit, because they're really, again, the management right now is scared of you. They're scared of workers now because everybody's talking and people are at their breaking point. Nobody can afford to buy a home. Nobody can afford to rent an apartment right now. Nobody can afford the food prices. You go to the grocery store, I'm carrying 3 bags out the grocery store and I paid $100.
Yep.
Like I tell people all the time, if you're carrying your bags and you don't need to roll it out to your car, if you still can carry your bags and you're over $100, that's a problem.
Yes.
And I'm not talking about because I'm strong or nothing, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, people are at their breaking point right now, and they're looking at their labor space as a means to fix their problems. And so the businesses right now are really afraid of that, and they're retreating in the ways in which you just mentioned because of it.
Yeah, I could shift a little bit, but in the same, obviously on the same topic is, you mentioned union militancy, right? And I think, some of our members would hear that and be like, "Oh, wait, get a little scared." I just draw pictures, or what I mean. Like we're artists, we're creative,
exactly,
right? And
yeah.
it's like we didn't get into this. A lot of our members didn't get into this to be militant. But I think we can take the curse off that word a little bit,
we
right?
Need to,
and say, look, it's not. It's about standing up to the power. Taking power back. It's about standing up for what we deserve. It's not, and I think that's where we're also seeing some of the shift. Little context. We've enjoyed in the IA and in the Hollywood and entertainment industry a fairly long period of labor stability.
Yeah.
We've had bargaining partners. And that's what you want. You want partners across that table who are willing to listen, who, there may be some tension there, obviously, because they've got their interests, we've got ours. But at the end of the day, you're getting that deal. You have to, right? We've seen a dramatic shift,
yes.
And I think it's talking about that going back to talking about that pot of money. I think with the influx of the tech industry,
yes,
that has seen this pot of money, and they said, oh well, this is also means to advance our own interests, our own tech, to exercise our power on another industry, to consolidate. They love that. All of these things, and we just, like I said, we happen to be a pretty big target. And so, but their interests as a bargaining partner are no longer aligned with ours.
No.
And I think in order to achieve the gains, we have to adopt some militancy.
Yeah.
But you want to speak a little bit about what
Sure.
that can mean,
Sure.
in terms of different tactics.
And again, militancy, unfortunately, because of the Red Scare and all this other anti-communist garbage that happened in the 50s and 60s, they have distorted the use of the word militant, just like they distorted the use of the word radical over the past 40, 50 years, which both words simply means is uniting a front for progressive change. That's literally all. Militancy is wearing a union t-shirt. Militancy is drawing a picture of somebody speaking out for their rights. All these things, I mean, it's a spectrum. Yeah, you can have a strike and you can do civil disobedience. You can have an urban rebellion. Yeah, those are very volatile and violent means of militancy, but there are cold means of having a teach-in. Us doing this podcast, we're being incredibly militant now just by speaking about the power of workers. So again, we as working people and those who support workers, we have to also do a better job of making sure that we take back control of the narrative of these words so people can embrace the word. People were proud to be militant. People were proud to be workers decades ago. Nowadays, nobody calls themselves working class or worker anymore, where it was a proud thing. There were two people in the world that used to say back in the day, those who work and those who don't. And you don't want to be the one who doesn't. So again, like I said, we have to go back and take control of these words. But simply, as you just mentioned, Andy, is that the idea of the militant is simply that you're willing to take a risk. Yes, it's not always an easy thing to discuss. The very idea that I had to stand in front of my 3,000 members as the president of my union and ask them to quit their jobs, and the means that if they all do it together with me, we will not only get them back, but we would have the strongest graduate worker contract in the country if we do it. I mean, it was one of the hardest things I ever had to do, and it was the hardest things for the members to have to make that decision because it is a risk. But as we've talked about before, because of this pot of money, as you mentioned, because the opposing side has taken a very strong stand against what they believe the future of work needs to look like, we have to be willing to step up and take risks if we want to improve our lives before we're all living outside of homes and apartments, because that's what the future's coming to right now. I mean, again, this is not something where we're just conspiracy theorying this stuff. We have research and data that shows, and quotes from management and employers where they have literally said, I mean, the Postmaster General of the United States, who's putting together this consolidation plan to basically destroy the postal service, particularly for rural folks and for poor people, has said that he wants to see 20,000 jobs cut from the postal service. He said it in an interview. You have Zaslav talking, Zaslav? Is that his name?
That's close enough.
Yeah, close enough. That clown. He got him saying things that are incredibly disrespectful and nasty towards the people behind the scenes who put all this work together to make a television show or to make a film. I mean, they have just become so explicitly disrespectful that the fact that we're questioning whether we should be militant goes to show how well the propaganda against unions and workers has gone over the decades. This is why the work that you all are doing here with IATSE, the IA, with all these other unions is so profound, because you're taking control of the narrative and showing your members that we're all in this together. We're never going to put you in a situation where you're in danger. We're going to have security and protection in the work we do, but we're going to have to take risks so that we can have a better future, not just for us, but for all these new workers that are coming into our industry who are getting ready to face really nasty ideas about work. So militancy is the most important thing that we have to develop, because it means collective resistance.
Yeah, I think it's very telling that and this isn't political, I just think in terms of the bosses they're just saying the quiet part out loud now.
Yeah.
Like
exactly,
they're not even being subtle about it. No. They're emboldened enough to say, yeah, well, I think not even the bosses, but even their mouthpieces. I think the other day, I think it was Ben Shapiro said that, we need to cut Social Security and entitlements because people just should keep working until they die.
No,
and that's literally what he said. Yeah. And I'm like, how is that reasonable? And it is so despicable and classist because not everybody has the opportunity. Like, what about those people who are working in jobs that are physically demanding? Like a lot of us in the entertainment industry. You look at those grips. You look at those folks in this industry who are lifting heavy loads. They are working 12 hours a day, and you've got the audacity to say out loud, you got to work till you die.
Well, here's the thing, though. Like, I've listened to some of the congressional debates on this, and they're actually will sit there and they'll say, well, listen now, science has shown us that the life expectancy of humans has actually gone up, so they're living a few years longer now. So why are we giving them Social Security so early? Why are we allowing people to retire? France just dropped their eligibility for Social Security by age. Why are we allowing these U.S. workers to simply just take money for retiring so young when they're dying later in life? The science is behind it, so you should have to retire at 80 now. Like, seriously, these are arguments they are making, and they're sending bills into committees about these things. And people don't think what happened in France could happen here. Okay.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to being, like you said, taking back that word, taking back that idea.
Exactly.
And being able to, in different ways, push back.
Exactly.
It's not, pitchforks and torches. It can be as simple as, like you said, wearing a shirt.
Exactly.
On set one day.
So again, if people don't want to be at the front, everybody has a role in the movement. You could be the person who's designing graphics. You could be the one tweeting or putting out a social media thing. You don't have to always be the one at the forefront. Everybody has a role. So again, I always tell those people who are so afraid, like, I don't want to be the one to talk, or I don't want to be the one to be at the front. Everybody doesn't have to do that. Once you know your skill or your interest, and you offer something of that nature, something you're really interested in, then we can use you in whatever campaign we're doing. We'll find a place. So again, you don't have to be forced into a role that you're not comfortable with. That's what's so cool about organizing from a militant place, is that everybody can use their interests and their skills to contribute in some way. That's all militancy is.
Well, I'm getting the wrap it up from Ricky over there. So I think any final thoughts on sort of where we're at in this discussion?
Sure.
I'll leave it to you.
Just make sure that everybody listening understands that the fights and the campaigns that our workers here, the art directors, the other guilds are fighting right now is a fight that every person who lives in this world has to fight at some point. This is about security, knowing that you can protect yourself and each other, and building power for yourself to last into the future. And so this is not an isolated one-time thing. This is something that we can all learn from, and this is all something that we need to be caring about and talking to each other about. So leave this podcast and go and tell people to listen, and also tell them what the experiences are of trying to do this work and needing a strong contract to protect yourself and your community.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Gus. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate your time. Appreciate taking some time to talk to us today. Talk to the members out there. I'm going to close with a little bit of housekeeping.
Please.
So, currently we're in our negotiation process. We having met with our bargaining partners, the AMPTP, last week to exchange some proposals, general and emerging technology proposals. AI, and then starting this Monday on the 18th, we'll be going into our local negotiations. And we also have some upcoming events. We've got our member orientation happening on April 6th, so please look out for that. Please watch your communications from our awesome communications team that put all of this together. Emails, Instagram, our social media channels. And finally, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social platforms at ADG 800 for episode 2 of the ADG podcast, Keepin' It 800. Thanks, everybody. Glad you were here.